well, he picked up the bass to join the band. He played violin and trumpet before, when he was at college at San Mateo, and he'd written some rather amazing jazz charts also.
Oh my gosh!
But he, Dana Morgan had a music store, and he was where the Warlocks rehearsed, and he sort of bowed out of the scene. And Jerry turned to Phil and said, "We need a bass player. Do you want to be him?" And Phil learned to play the bass for that purpose.
Right, I know that. And then in that music store, there was just a lot of like impromptu sort of jamming that was going on there. And did you wind up there as well?
Well, this is also the period of time, like 65, 67. I was spirited away into the military. So I was still in touch. We spoke on the phone. We wrote letters and stuff, but I wasn't physically present, alas, when the Warlocks got together and when all that started to happen.
You know, this is the fascinating part, because I cannot think of a more... I mean, you got into the Army, and then eventually, you became a sergeant. And,
oh, yes.
I mean, you were an extremely competent military personnel, and yet, at the same time, I believe LSD was legal at that point.
Well, I was a computer programmer for the Air Force, which is what I did. It's amusing thinking that you're into... I was into computers like 50 years ago.
I know.
They were a little bit different. But
they were like as big as my head. They're huge.
I feel like a biplane pilot, from World War I. But I still knew that I would rather be playing keyboards with the Grateful Dead than re-up for another term in the military.
Absolutely. I'm looking at it today and how the military has become so streamlined and so conservative, sort of, if that's the right word. And here you are working on these IBM mainframes. Like we said, computers have changed quite a bit, and you're tinkering on. You're making your own music. That's and then as a sergeant, you get these exemptions, these 3-day exemptions to drive across into, I guess, to Los Angeles to cut Anthem of the Sun. Can you? I mean, how did that unfold? Did they just call you up and say, "TC, we need you for the," or were you and Phil in constant contact about that? It wasn't like something that happened at the last minute.
No, we had been in constant contact, and actually he sent me tape recordings. You remember those reel-to-reel tape recordings of their rushes, of their takes of the material that they were working on, so I could listen and go into the studio somewhat more prepared. It was all scheduled. I had won a 3-day pass because some of the higher-ups, the base commander particularly, liked me. And so I got a couple of 3-day passes. I had leave, and during my leave, I went to American Recorders in Van Nuys and hit the gyroscope to the sounding board and blew away Dave Hassinger.
Yeah, talk about what you did, the gyroscope. I mean, that to me, when I read that, and there was also these coins you were putting in there as well?
Yes. These are influence of John Cage and the prepared piano and other people in his school. I find that you can fit a dime, and this is really non-destructive. I mean, some of the things that people did to the pianos are really, piano technicians cringe because it really harms the instrument. But I could put in the coin and take it out, and you'd never know it was there. You fit a dime. A penny's a bit too big because it touches the adjacent strings, but you wedge it between the 3 strings of a given note, and you get a sound a little bit like a cowbell, a deliciously complex sound.
Mm.
And Cage would put together maybe 15 or 20 of these on specific notes, and he'd have this gamelan orchestra controlled by a piano keyboard. The other preparations, I'd take clothespins and put them on the lower strings at the harmonic nodes where the overtones fit, and again, you get these exquisitely complex sounds as a result. Now, the gyroscope, I took the toy, the kid's toy, gave the string a good yank, and I just put it up against the sounding board of the keyboard. Now, it doesn't do any harm to the piano, but it sounds like a chainsaw.
Wow.
And I did not see it because of the sight lines, but I heard from Bob Weir that the producer cleared his seat by 3 feet. I mean, he exploded when he heard that.
I'm actually curious, when you came in, I mean, you had known Phil. Did you know the other guys in the band? And I have to believe that, like someone like Garcia, he must have just loved sort of the sonic expansion that you were bringing. But I would love you to tell me how they thought about these sort of little ingenuity kind of entrepreneurial things you were bringing in?
Well, Jerry, as you might expect, was already in touch and on board. Phil had introduced me to him in, I don't know the exact date, it was sometime in September 1961. And he visited our place. We went and visited him down on the peninsula. And we had a musical mutual admiration society going full bore already by then. But Jerry was much into the Carter family, Appalachian folk songs. As you said earlier, this was the height of the folk revival. Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez. Bob Dylan even started out doing folk coffee houses like in Greenwich Village. And Jerry was already on board. I didn't know Bill. Mickey came on the scene about the time of Anthem of the Sun. Weir was an interesting character to meet. And, of course, Pigpen was universally wonderful. I mean, he and I were very close. We were roommates on the road. We shared a house. A great and wonderful gentleman who I still miss every day.
I was going to ask you about that because when you became very close with Pigpen, and you guys wound up sharing a house, and it was towards the end of. I mean, he had psoriasis, or he was really not in great health, and but you guys yet still talk about the things that how you became so close. Because for a while, I guess on stage, I mean, there's not a lot of video per se, but when you were there, you were playing organ and keyboards, and he was kind of playing maracas and percussion. Can you? I mean,
yeah.
And so talk about your relationship with Pig, if you could, because I think that he was the leader of that band for a long time.
Oh, it was two bands. It was when he was fronting it, it was a different band than when Jerry was fronting it. It became a different sort of creature, and you think about it, if he'd still been around, the band would have gone in other directions.
How do you? Yeah, in your mind, would it have become more of a blues band? It already was.
Well, it was definitely a blues band when he was fronting it.
Right.
And his father, Phil, had been a blues DJ who went by the on-air name of Cool Breeze. And Pigpen had this encyclopedic knowledge of that idiom. I remember at the Woodstock Festival in the hotel before we went in to play, Nicky Hopkins came to our room, and he and Pigpen, I should have taken notes. It was an education, listening to them talk about these old blues players that they knew about and comparing notes, and they were both so aware of all that, and I was like a sponge just drinking it up.
What were they? Who were they talking about? I mean, they were talking about the Delta blues characters, or what?
Those, of course, like Blind Willie McTell, but also the old blues and boogie players: Albert Ammons, Pinetop Smith, Meade Lux Lewis, Willie the Lion Smith.
Right.
The whole it's like it opened a door to a whole new museum full of impressions and things to learn about.
You said Weir was an interesting character. I had an opportunity to interview him, and tell me why what engaged you about him when you first met him.
I suppose he was the only one in the band who really looked like a rock star, who really had that element to him. He was. Jerry sometimes said some of his tunes he was like a crooner.
Right.
And he had that down more than anybody. That smooth, even glossy sort of presentation. And he was a lot better guitar player, I think, than a lot of people gave him credit for also. And he and I, the only times we got a chance to really break out into a solo was when Jerry broke a string. And then suddenly the light's on, and you got to deal with what you got to deal with. And he came out with some deliciously wonderful solos. I remember a couple of times at the Fillmore East, and I'm comping, doing my course, and Jerry broke a string, and he's back changing strings, and Weir steps up.
Yeah, I mean, the more I listen to certain periods of the Dead, the more I respect his playing. It really was, and it's interesting to hear that he was that good at that time as well, which is really amazing.
And also, even when Jerry didn't break a string, the way that Weir would fill in with these chords, he had this style. He would find this slot where it fit. And I've heard it's just great about, I played piano in a ragtime band in the 70s, It's like you don't really hear it, but you would notice a difference if it wasn't there.
That's exactly right.
And especially it's challenging for him, as it was for me, because you have your basic power trio components. You have guitar, bass, and drums, like Cream or like Blue Cheer or Jimi Hendrix. And each of the three can go flat out on the floorboard and really express themselves flat out without worrying about clashing with everybody else. But if you add anything else, you have to be careful to place it right so that it doesn't upset the balance. And guitar is the same tessiture as the lead guitar, so he had to be careful and pick his spots. And there's a real high art to that, I think.
And yeah, not stepping on anybody else's sound, but filling in your own sound within that is just brilliant.
Oh, yes.
And I think you were TC was just like that. And we're going to listen to another tune here, an old folk tune, bluegrass tune, and then we'll come back and talk
Great.
about it. All right. The drummer for Terry Riley, and he.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, and a dear friend and a real.
I saw Kyle once. I remember at the Great American Music Hall with Terry on keyboards and George on drums.
What was the name of the band?
Kyle, Khayal.
Wow. You know, what he talked about was just the idea of this period in our history, and I know it's written about in books and stuff, but I just, being a primary source journalist, I really wanted to talk to you about the idea of legal LSD and how it was used within the constructs of the Grateful Dead. Like, how often were you? I mean, is it folklore? Is it actually true that you guys were?
It happened all right, and it definitely adds a additional viewpoint to your music. It expands it. You're looking at it from outside in a way. You see all sorts of possibilities. Earlier, you played a sonata of Beethoven, the Opus 28. I was working another time in the Opus 14, number 2, the E major sonata, and one afternoon I tripped, and I started playing through it, and all these images of 1790s Vienna came into my head. I just saw the horse-drawn carriages, the cobblestone streets, the buildings, and later when I went to Vienna, it all rang so true.
Oh.
And I started to wonder, like, how much information is encapsulated in that music. And of course, definitely with the Grateful Dead, players and people who listen to it as well, you can read so much into it. It's such a ganglion of connectivity. And that's one of the things that acid brought out. It turned out, though, that it's not the best thing to perform on. If you can get so fascinated by the sounds, you'll just play one note and listen to it for 10 minutes. And that's good enough for you.
Right. And so, I mean, that's what was interesting, because you and Pigpen were kind of like abstaining from it after a while. I was like, no, I don't want to, because this is affecting my playing, right? And the other guys were still pretty much into it. But I mean, you guys are playing on average 2 or 3 sets a night, and probably up to 4 or 5 hours a night.
Oh, yeah.
And, just when you're, I mean, I've done my own share of it, but it's like, you how do you continue to, like, on a Dark Star piece, I guess you could actually float and be okay in that setting. Whereas with like an Uncle John's band, like you were saying, where you're, a zillion different chord changes, it would be harder to play when you're on acid. Oh, definitely. Well, remember that the Dark Star, the extended jams were more during the more psychedelic era. Uncle John's band, and tunes like On Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, we were finally giving in to the record company's desire to have that 3-minute single, right,
and which was antithetical to the extended jams, your Love Light, your Alligator Caution, where in fact, a lot of times that was our entire set.
Right.
The Dark Star, to Love Light, and Alligator Caution, and that's 2 hours of material right there, with 4 tunes. And it wasn't always that we were tripping and that was what it was about. A lot of times we would rehearse that way, and you would learn things that you could put into words, and also that intuitive grasp that develops over time that good bands have, where they have this connection from one player to another that they just don't have to say anything. It's known. It's right there. You're in touch with it. And once we had that, we didn't have to go back and trip again to get it, because it was there. That's actually really well put. TC, I wanted to. This is interesting to me. You have been a professional